There it goes. Well, hopefully all this will work tonight. Last week, we did the sermon and did the lesson and everything, and then Thursday, I got in there because on Thursdays I convert Sunday's sermon and my sermon into audio files and put them on CDs, and Sylvia actually comes and gets them and takes them. We've got a couple of folks that like listening to the CDs, and she takes them over to them. But my sermon didn't record. The video was there, but there was no audio on it at all, and so it took quite a while for me to figure out what exactly the problem was and how to fix it. And I hadn't done anything. It just, you know how computers are. Sometimes they do an update or something and it decides, you don't need this. We'll just change this. Anyway, but that's what happened, and just kind of threw it all off. And so I had to re-record it. And anyway, so hopefully it's right now and it hadn't done anything that I didn't want it to do for tonight. In my opinion, one of the most fascinating and important characters that we find not only in Scripture, but I think in history, is Moses. I love Moses. And many of you, I'm sure, remember watching Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments when you were younger. I remember watching it. Anybody ever see it at the theaters? Nobody saw it at the theater. I was just curious. That would be a phenomenal movie to watch at a theater, like on a big screen.
First grade.
You were in first?
Don't look at me.
Oh. I didn't know who said it. I was...
in jail. He always zeroes in on me. My school took a bus to Denton. Loaded up the whole grade school.
Really? And went and watched it? That would have been so cool. Of course, when I was in first grade, I don't know that I would have found it that interesting. But anyway, but I remember, growing up, every year it was on TV. And I remember the whole family would, of course, this was, before cable and all that kind of stuff, but the whole family would sit around the TV and watch the Ten Commandments every year. I think it was at Easter or something, generally when it was on. Anyway. And there's no question that Moses' life is an interesting story. But it's a whole lot more than that. And I'd like for us to take a closer look at some of the events in his life that have happened in his life, and in doing so, discover some lessons for ourselves today. Lessons that he learned from, but that we can look at and see how they can apply to us today. So this week we're going to begin, I guess you could say, a new series, if you will, that's going to deal with some of the lessons from the life of Moses. And in order to do this, I want to examine some of the highlights, okay? We're certainly not going to be going through his life, we're not going through Exodus a verse at a time, okay? That ain't happening, okay? We're going to just look at some of the highlights and some of those turning points, if you will, and pull them out and look at them and examine them a little bit. And we'll see what God has to say to us today through those events. Now, speaking in reference to some of the events that happened in the Old Testament, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10:6, he said, "Now these things became examples for us." And what he was referring to were some things that happened with Moses and other things in the Old Testament. And he said that those were examples for us. And so we're going to use that as well for examples for us now. Not just in Paul's time, but for us as well. There are things that happened to Moses, and they happened for a reason. And one of those reasons, I think, is so that God could teach us more about himself. So tonight I want us to look at how God placed a special call on Moses' life. God had huge plans, had big plans for Moses. And I want you to realize that God also has big plans for each of you. He used Moses in a great way, and He wants to use you in a great way as well. In reading Exodus, you kind of get the feeling that Moses always had a sense of God's call on his life. I think he knew that God wanted to use him in some way, but it took him some time to determine exactly how he was to fulfill what God wanted him to do. The lesson Moses eventually learned is that a person becomes most effective in life once they decide to do God's will, God's way. So as we look at how Moses came to discover God's will, perhaps it'll help you to discover God's plan for your life as well. So let's take a little closer look. First of all, Moses' story teaches us your entire life has been leading up to God's call. Your entire life has been leading up to God's call. As you look at the life of Moses, you can see how God prepared him from the very beginning. As you follow the story, you can see God's hand in it all along the way. Many of you grew up learning about Moses' life, but for those who didn't, probably not any of us here, but certainly maybe somebody who's watching this online, and you don't know all of the particulars about Moses' life, we're going to do a real brief Reader's Digest condensed version, if you will, of Moses' life. Just kind of a brief summary, okay? When Moses was born, the Hebrew people were slaves in Egypt. Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, felt threatened by the growing number of Hebrew children. So he ordered that all newborn Hebrew males were supposed to be put to death. And Moses' mother couldn't bear to turn him over to the Egyptian authorities. So she hid his birth as long as she could. And finally, in a desperate attempt to spare his life, she placed him in a basket and put him in the Nile River, hoping and praying that somehow, some way, God would protect him and guide him to safety. Well, God answered her prayer, because Moses was discovered in the Nile by the Pharaoh's daughter, who took him and raised him as her own. Stephen's speech in Acts 7 tells us more about the early life of Moses. Even though he was born a Hebrew slave, God worked it out that Moses would be raised in the house of Pharaoh and educated in the wisdom of the Egyptians. Stephen said Moses was powerful in speech and action. And I encourage you at some point, read Acts 7. You find that part, that he was powerful in speech and action in verses 20 through 22. Once he reached adulthood, Moses had the desire to rescue his people from the torment of their Egyptian captors. And one day Moses witnessed a Hebrew man who was being mistreated by an Egyptian. So he killed the Egyptian. And Stephen tells us that Moses thought the Hebrew people would recognize that he could rescue them. But they didn't. As a matter of fact, this event forced Moses to flee the country and live in the land of Midian. And it appeared that his dream to save the Hebrew people had gone up in smoke. For the next 40 years, Moses tended flocks belonging to his father-in-law. It would appear to the casual observer that Moses had been forgotten by God, that he had failed and had become nothing more than what could have been. But God didn't forget about Moses, and he didn't forget about the plight of his people. During this time, as we'll see here in a few moments, there were some important changes taking place in Moses' personal life. This 40 years as a sheep herder was a time of character building. God was waiting for the day when he could use Moses in a great way. And in the very same way, God can use the events in your life as points of preparation for the calling that he's given you. There's a reason you were born into the family into which you were born. There's a reason you grew up in the geographic area and location that you grew up in. There's a reason you're alive right now in this generation. All the events of your life, both good and bad, are part of the process of preparation that God has. Maybe you feel that your life up to this point has just been a total failure. Maybe you once had a dream for what you could accomplish, and right now it appears that you've fallen desperately short of the mark. Maybe you've made some mistakes and have made a complete mess of everything, and it's caused you to believe that your only choice is to give up and quit. Maybe something painful happened in your childhood or in your past. Something that caused you to wonder, why me? Why did that have to happen to me? Why did I have to go through that? God can use the events of your entire life, even the mistakes and the things that are beyond your control, to design your life in a way that it will bring Him glory. Right now, today, you're being trained for God's purpose. God is using this time to prepare you for the work that He's called you to do. And even your most painful, most regrettable experiences can become a part of the process of preparation. God has big plans for each and every one of you. And your entire life has been leading you towards that fulfillment. The second thing that I want you to notice about discovering God's plan is that God will wait until you're ready to be used. I tried to come up with some modern day examples to get my thoughts across here, and I had a little bit of difficulty. And one of the things that I could come up with deals with sports, which honestly, and I've mentioned this before, I don't know that much about. Okay? But back in Wichita, there were a couple of guys that I knew. They were brothers, twins, who played football, were very good at football, and were recruited to play for the NFL. It was the Bell brothers. I don't know how many of y'all remember that. But Mark and Mike Bell were recruited to go into the NFL. And one of the things that I noticed in looking at sports was that there's a difference in the way football teams and baseball teams recruit people. Okay? They recruit rookies in totally different ways. Most NFL teams will sign some hotshot rookie to a multi-million-dollar deal and expect to get their money's worth in the first season. The problem is that it rarely works out that way. There are a whole lot of players who excelled in college and were highly sought after by NFL teams, but it turned out that they simply weren't ready for the challenges of playing in the NFL. However, Major League Baseball uses a completely different strategy. It's not uncommon at all for a baseball team to sign a rookie to a high-priced contract and then send him to play Double-A ball at one of their lesser-known minor league clubs until that person becomes ready to play in the major leagues. God's method is more like the baseball model than the football model. God is not going to throw you to the lions before you're ready. He gives you the chance to prepare. Years ago, there was a contemporary Christian music group called Truth. The director of this group once said, "God will never use you publicly until He has tutored you privately." God will prepare you. He will tutor you, if you will, for the work that He's called you to do. Sometimes this means letting you take some bumps in the minor leagues while you're preparing for the majors. You notice that many Broadway shows typically debut off Broadway. They do that so that the kinks in the performance can be worked out. They want to make sure that when the play is presented in an internationally recognized theater, that it's perfect. Everything's worked out. It's as ready as it possibly can be. In the same way, God gives you the opportunity to succeed and fail on a smaller level while you're getting to the point in your life where you're ready to be used on a greater level. When Moses intervened in the conflict between the Egyptian and the Israelite, he thought his time had come. He thought he was ready, but he wasn't. He wanted to save the Hebrew people from the oppression of their captors, and according to the book of Acts, he expected them to recognize him as their Savior. Only that didn't work. Moses still had some lessons to learn. His ego was still in the way. His heart wasn't where it needed to be. And in his effort to be the hero, he killed an Egyptian. And when that was made public, he ran to avoid being executed by Pharaoh. He eventually ended up in Midian, where he met his wife. He became the father of 2 sons, and he spent the next 40 years working as a sheep herder. The years spent in the desert proved to be a very crucial time in Moses' preparation for leadership. The man God spoke to through the burning bush was not the same man who had run from Egypt 40 years before. God had been waiting for Moses to be ready to be used. And when the time finally arrived, there was a tremendous difference in Moses' attitude. I'm sure you remember this story. Look at Exodus 3, verses 6 through 10. Exodus 3, verses 6 through 10. This is God speaking. It says, "Then he continued, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, "I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt, and I have heard them crying out because of their oppressors. And I know about their sufferings. I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them from that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the territory of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. The Israelites' cry for help has come to me, and I have also seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore go. I am sending you to Pharaoh so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Now, 40 years earlier, Moses had been ready to kill off the Egyptians one at a time. And now he's confronted with God's plan for his life, the idea of rescuing the Hebrew people generates an entirely different response from him. And I think I put in your notes there some of Moses' responses to God. In Exodus 3:11, he said, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" In Exodus 4:1, he said, "What if they won't believe me and will not obey me, but say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" In Exodus 4:10, he said, "Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, either in the past or recently or since you have been speaking to your servant, because I am slow and hesitant in speech." In Exodus 4:13, he said, "Please, Lord, send someone else." That's quite a difference from the younger Moses. Before Moses' problem wasn't that he was self-confident. His problem was that he was overconfident. He was putting too much faith in himself and not enough faith in God. And it took 40 years in the desert for Moses to learn to let go of his pride. And as soon as Moses was ready, God put his plan into action. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of the slavery went up to God. And God heard their groaning. Look at Exodus 2. Verses 24 and 25 says, "So God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the Israelites, and he took notice." I like the way the Living Bible translates this. Let me read it to you. It says, "He heard their cries from heaven and remembered his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to bring their descendants back into the land of Canaan. Looking down upon them, he knew that the time had come for their rescue." I love that. I love the way that's worded. Now, here's an important distinction that we need to understand. God didn't make Moses wait until he was 80 years old to be used in a great way. Moses made God wait that long. It took 40 years in the desert before Moses had reached the point where his confidence was in God and not in himself. He didn't have to wait until he was 80. He chose to. It was his choice. And keep this in mind. I know I'm up here talking and teaching this, and a lot of y'all are going, "Oh yeah, but God's already used me." Moses was 80. Okay? Just keep that in mind. In contrast, King David was ready to be used by God when he was just a teenager. God has big plans for each and every one of us. And there's a lot that you can do to accomplish your life story for his glory. But he's not going to send you into battle until you're equipped for the fight. Naturally, there are times when you wait on God's timing. That's part of doing God's will, God's way. But don't make God wait on you. He can't use you until you're ready, so get ready. Be absolutely devoted to God, absolutely determined to do his will, absolutely dependent upon his strength in your life. The sooner you come to this point in your life, the sooner God can begin to use you the way He wants to. And the third thing that I want you to notice about discovering God's plan for your life is God's dreams are bigger than yours. As a young man, Moses had a dream of helping people. His idea was to help the Hebrew people one by one, as we saw in the story of him killing the Egyptian. When that plan failed, he fled to Midian, and once again came to the rescue of someone who was in trouble. There's a group of women who were attempting to draw water for their father from the well, but they were driven away by a group of shepherds. Moses stood up for the women. He chased off the shepherds and made it possible for the women to get water. The young women were very impressed with Moses. Their father was very impressed with Moses as well. In fact, he invited Moses to his home, and eventually Moses married one of the women that he met at the well. Moses' ambition was to go through life helping people. His idea apparently was that he would help people one at a time. An oppressed Hebrew here, a damsel in distress over there. However, God had a dream for Moses that was bigger than Moses could have ever imagined. God's plan was that Moses would lead a nation of slaves to freedom. The Israelites had been in bondage for more than 430 years, and God chose Moses to release them from captivity. Some 40-odd years before God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, when Moses first conceived his dream of rescuing the Israelites, he had no idea how big this dream was going to become. That's because at this point, it was just his dream. And the simple truth is, our plans are smaller than God's plans. We dream of having a little bit of success in life because a little bit of success can be quite comfortable. But God's dream will take you beyond your comfort zone and challenge you to do something bigger than anything you could have ever imagined. When Lew Wallace wrote the book Ben-Hur in 1880, he optimistically told his wife that the book could earn him up to $100 a year in royalties. Now, that was pretty decent money in 1880, enough to live on. Of course, this novel about a slave who converts to Christianity eventually sold over 50 million copies. It's been made into 3 motion pictures. 2 were silent films, and then the one starring Charlton Heston, who, ironically enough, was also in the Ten Commandments. This book has never been out of print. Still. The end result was that Lew Wallace and his heirs have earned more from this story than he could have ever imagined possible. I found a quote from Jamie Buckingham, another author and theologian. And he said this: attempt something so great that unless God intervenes, you're sure to fail. This kind of has a jump first and pray second kind of feel to it. I understand what it is that he's trying to say there. I just don't know that I agree with the way that he's going about saying it. I would not want to constantly live my life that way. I'd much rather urge you to include God from the start. Doing God's will, God's way, involves asking Him to give you a dream for your life that is so magnificent that unless He fuels the dream, you have no chance of succeeding. Moses never could have accomplished all that he did without the miraculous power of God in his life. That's the difference between God's plans and our plan. We make small plans. God makes big plans. It's impossible to have more vision than God. It's impossible to have more faith than God. It's impossible to have more courage than God. Do God's will, God's way. Let Him give you a dream, His dream. Let Him help you develop a plan, His plan for your life. And you can be sure that His dreams and His plans and His goals are bigger than yours are. And with His help, they are always possible. God said this through the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. God has big plans for each and every one of us. If you're trying to live according to your own goals and dreams and plans, you're at risk of wasting whatever is left of your life. The first lesson we need to learn from the life of Moses is that you will be most effective in life if you seek to do God's will, God's way. Your entire life has been leading up to this point. God has big plans for you. So be ready to hear the call. Take out your prayer sheets, if you would.